The Cats of Ulthar by H.P. Lovecraft. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Austin Lim. The Cats of Ulthar by H.P. Lovecraft. It is said that in Ulthar, which lies beyond the river sky, no man may kill a cat. And this I can verily believe, as I gaze upon him who sitteth purring before the fire. For the cat is cryptic, and close to strange things which men cannot see. He is the soul of antique Egyptus, and bearer of tales from forgotten cities in Meroe and Ophir. He is the kin of the jungle's lords, and heir to the secrets of hoary and sinister Africa. The Sphinx is his cousin, and he speaks her language, but he is more ancient than the Sphinx, and remembers that which she hath forgotten. In Ulthar, before ever the burgesses forbade the killing of cats, there dwelt an old cotter and his wife, who delighted to trap and slay the cats of their neighbors. Why they did this I know not, save that many hate the voice of the cat in the night, and take it ill that cats should run stealthily about yards and gardens at twilight. But whatever the reason, this old man and woman took pleasure in trapping and slaying every cat which came near to their hovel, and from some of the sounds heard after dark, many villagers fancied that the manner of slaying was exceedingly peculiar. But the villagers did not discuss such things with the old man and his wife, because of the habitual expression on the withered faces of the two, and because their cottage was so small and so darkly hidden under spreading oaks at the back of a neglected yard. In truth, much as the owners of cats hated these odd folk, they feared them more, and instead of berating them as brutal assassins, merely took care that no cherished pet or mouser should stray toward the remote hovel under the dark trees. When through some unavoidable oversight a cat was missed, and sounds heard after dark, the loser would lament impotently, or console himself by thanking fate it was not one of his children who had thus vanished. For the people of Ulthar were simple, and knew not whence it is all cats first came. One day a caravan of strange wanderers from the south entered the narrow cobbled streets of Ulthar. Dark wanderers they were, and unlike the other roving folk who passed through the village twice every year. In the marketplace they told fortunes for silver, and bought gay beads from the merchants. What was the land of these wanderers none could tell, but it was seen that they were given to strange prayers, and that they had painted on the sides of their wagons strange figures with human bodies, and the heads of cats, hawks, rams, and lions. And the leader of the caravan wore a headdress with 2 horns and a curious disc betwixt the horns. There was in this singular caravan a little boy with no father or mother, but only a tiny black kitten to cherish. The plague had not been kind to him, yet had left him this small furry thing to mitigate his sorrow. And when one is very young, one can find great relief in the lively antics of a black kitten. So the boy whom the dark people called Menes smiled more often than he wept, as he sat playing with his graceful kitten on the steps of an oddly painted wagon. On the 3rd morning of the wanderer's stay in Ulthar, Menes could not find his kitten, and as he sobbed aloud in the marketplace, certain villagers told him of the old man and his wife, and of sounds heard in the night. And when he heard these things, his sobbing gave place to meditation, and finally to prayer. He stretched his arms toward the sun and prayed in a tongue no villager could understand, though indeed the villagers did not try very hard to understand, since their attention was mostly taken up by the sky and the odd shapes the clouds were assuming. It was very peculiar, but as the boy uttered his petition, there seemed to form overhead the shadowy, nebulous figures of exotic things, of hybrid creatures crowned with horn-flanked discs. Nature is full of such illusions to impress the imaginative. That night the wanderers left Ulthar and were never seen again, and the householders were troubled when they noticed that in all the village there was not a cat to be found. From each hearth the familiar cat had vanished, cats large and small, black, gray, striped yellow and white. Old Cranon, the burgomaster, swore that the dark folk had taken the cats away in revenge for the killing of Menes' kitten, and cursed the caravan and the little boy. But Nith, the lean notary, declared that the old cotter and his wife were more likely persons to suspect, for their hatred of cats was notorious and increasingly bold. Still, no one durst complain to the sinister couple, even when little Atal, the innkeeper's son, vowed that he had at twilight seen all the cats of Ulthar in that accursed yard under the trees, pacing very slowly and solemnly in a circle around the cottage, two abreast, as if in performance of some unheard-of rite of beasts. The villagers did not know how much to believe from so small a boy, and though they feared that the old pair had charmed the cats to their death, they preferred not to chide the old cotter till they met him outside his dark and repellent yard. So Ulthar went to sleep in vain anger, and when the people awakened at dawn, behold, every cat was back at his accustomed hearth. Large and small, black, gray, striped, yellow, and white, none was missing. Very sleek and fat did the cats appear, and sonorous with purring content. The citizens talked with one another of the affair, and marveled not a little. Old Cranon again insisted that it was the dark folk who had taken them, since cats did not return alive from the cottage of the ancient man and his wife. But all agreed on one thing, that the refusal of all the cats to eat their portions of meat or drink their saucers of milk was exceedingly curious. And for 2 whole days the sleek, lazy cats of Ulthar would touch no food, but only doze by the fire or in the sun. It was fully a week before the villagers noticed that no lights were appearing at dusk in the windows of the cottage under the trees. Then the lean Nith remarked that no one had seen the old man or his wife since the night the cats were away. In another week the burgomaster decided to overcome his fears and call at the strangely silent dwelling as a matter of duty, though in so doing he was careful to take with him Shang the blacksmith and Thul the cutter of stone as witnesses. And when they had broken down the frail door, they found only this: 2 cleanly picked human skeletons on the earthen floor, and a number of singular beetles crawling in the shadowy corners. There was subsequently much talk among the burgesses of Ulthar. Zath, the coroner, disputed at length with Nith, the lean notary, and Cranon and Shang and Thul were overwhelmed with questions. Even little Atal, the innkeeper's son, was closely questioned and given a sweetmeat as a reward. They talked of the old cotter and his wife, of the caravan of dark wanderers, of small Manise and his black kitten, of the prayer of Manise and of the sky during that prayer, of the doings of the cats on the night the caravan left, and of what was later found in the cottage under the dark trees in the repellent yard. And in the end, the burgesses passed that remarkable law which is told of by traders in Hathig and discussed by travelers in Near, namely, that in Ulthar no man may kill a cat. End of The Cats of Ulthar. Recording by Austin Lim. www.austinlim.com.
The Substitute by Georgia Wood Pangborn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Dallman. The Substitute by Georgia Wood Pangborn. The day's heat, for a time made endurable by a small breeze, had been weighed down toward evening by a thunderous humidity. Only along the line of the beach was it tolerable. Miss Marston had sat so long over her coffee that the room was now in twilight, but she had intercepted by a fretful gesture the maid who would have turned on the light. Her dining-room windows overlooked the water. 50 feet below she could see the blurred figures of people on the beach, and could hear their voices at intervals. Among them, the piping staccato of Mrs. Vandoyne's convalescent children, allowed to stay up and be active in the cool of the evening to atone for the languor of the afternoon. Now and then, the fretful cry of an ailing baby overrode the other voices, but the babies that were sent to Mrs. Vandoyne's always got well. That was her very wonderful business, making them well. The heat was like a presence, a thing of definite substance that could be touched, like a drug, too, making the senses strange, distorting distance and time. Although her eyes were upon the ocean, where the foam appeared and vanished dimly in long lines, lit only a little way out by the lights of the pierhead, It was the dark campus of her college town that Anna Marston's vision beheld, and the unsteady foam crest of the waves were girls in white dresses. Long rows of them, coming and going within the obscurity of the trees. "I am 32, said Mrs. Marston aloud, and for that reason thought more keenly about when she was 22. The same heavy air had folded in the evening of her commencement day, yet the girls had not seemed to mind. "I suppose we had plenty of other things to think about," said she. For a while she had gone about the campus with them, singing and laughing, and then, like this, had come to her window seat to think, to decide finally not to marry Willis. And Mary Hannaford came in, Mary Hannaford, to show me her ring. I told her she was silly. Miss Marston moved restlessly. Matters long ago forgotten will upon occasion freakishly insist upon remembrance, approaching suddenly, like the surprise of a familiar face in a crowded street. A dream plucks us by the sleeve, and we turn to see a childish countenance, which has no more right than our own to inextinguishable youth. Or again, a word or a bar of music causes the barrier of years to fall as though it had never been, and we are in gardens that were dust years and years ago. Having once returned, these revenants keep us company for a while. "I don't see why I should keep on thinking of Mary Hannaford," said Miss Marston, and went on thinking about Mary Hannaford, that perhaps she had not been silly after all, but rather sensible to marry, instead of keeping sulkily to something she called an ideal, as Anna Marston had done. "I wish," said Miss Marston, vaguely, then frowned as the cry of a sick baby came up from the beach. "Children," she said, yet her tone, though troubled, was not exactly that of annoyance. Annoyance does not make the eyes wet. She struck her clutched hand into her open palm, then lay back, drowsily inert in attitude, except that her underlip was caught between her teeth, and her forehead was wrinkled with discontent. She knew that the maids had slipped out for their walk on the beach. They had passed in their black and white, giggling, to the bluff stairs, and their squeals of joy at their release had reached her as soon as they were out of sight. She was alone, therefore, yet she did not feel as if she were alone. Not that there seemed to be another presence in the house, but the house itself had changed. Girls, so many, went in light-footed haste through the halls. The room in which she sat was no longer a conventional dining room. The walls, hidden in shadow, were garishly sprinkled with photographs and college pendants. The cushions of the window seat were bright with college colors, and in a moment more Mary Hannaford would come in, wanting to talk under cover of the darkness about how happy she was, how fortunate above all other girls in the world. Mary Hannaford again! Someone spoke her name. She sat up quickly and was aware of the indistinct pallor of a face. It was by the voice, however, rather than by anything she saw, that she recognized her visitor. "Why, Mary Hannaford," she said, "I haven't seen you for 10 years, and I've been thinking of you all day." The figure came swiftly and seated itself at the other end of the window seat. Anna sank back, her sudden rousing having caused that odd vertigo which is common enough in times of great heat. She could not have said whether for an instant her hand touched that of her guest or not. When the dizziness had passed, Mary was speaking. She sat with her knees drawn up and her hands clasped about them in the attitude Anna so well remembered. "It's ever so long since I stopped being Mary Hannaford. I am Mary Barkley, you know." "Of course! You were the first of our set to go. How romantic we all felt about it! But you stopped writing after the babies came. All girls do. That's what turns us old maids so sour. At least, partly. But do tell me, have you a cottage here? And how did you come to find me?" Mary Barkley appeared to be looking down at the beach. She did not answer her friend's eager queries. Anna Marston leaned forward and regarded her anxiously. "Aren't you feeling fit? You seem so pale." "Oh, quite." Anna reached out toward the electric button, but Mary Barkley's hand intervened, protesting. We don't want lights, do we? Don't you remember how we always liked to talk in the dark like this? Well, laughed Anna, I'd just as soon you didn't see my wrinkles yet. You look just the same, except that you haven't any color. You had the reddest cheeks in the class. And you didn't marry after all, said Mary Barkley slowly. No, admitted Anna, rather fretfully. The right man wouldn't have me. That is like you. You'd never make a second choice. Not that I think it's wise of you. From the beach, the baby's cry rose again, weak, fretful, insistent. Anna Marston fidgeted. One of Mrs. Van Doyen's patients. Of course I know the children there are all right, but sometimes I wish they weren't quite so near. That's a Marasmus baby that came today. Its parents are very rich people. She's keeping the children on the beach late this evening for the coolness. Think, she broke out suddenly, think what this day has been for the babies in the tenements. If it has been bad here, what must have it been like there? Yes, said Mary Barkley. It is very bad in the city just now. She was looking steadily down toward the beach. Anna waited for a moment, then asked timidly, Aren't you going to tell me something about yourself and your family? 10 years is a long time in which to know nothing of a friend. Time enough for tragedies that will not bear discussing. Calvin died 3 years ago, said Mary Barkley after a silence. I didn't know, said Anna softly. 3 years ago. Benny was a year old then. There wasn't anything. We had been living on his salary. Death. We had forgotten there was such a thing. I found work. You know I had a sort of cleverness about clothes. I found fashion work that paid pretty well, only they weren't very strong babies. They had to have the best, or they wouldn't stay, you know. Until now, they've stayed. They are well now, then? They are well now. Anna rose with an exclamation and walked up and down. Then I envy you. What a full life, working, and for your own children. Lucky woman! In spite of your sorrow, lucky, lucky woman. Look at me. What good am I? I started out being my father's companion and secretary. It did very well for a time. Then he married again, and I took my mother's fortune and went on my own. Clubs, municipal reform, every galvanic imitation of life I could find. I've been so desperate at times. I know, said Mary Barkley. How can you know? Anne halted in her pacing to stare at her friend through the obscurity. That was partly why I came over here, said Mary Barkley, in an odd, still voice. I had to come anyway, to see my babies. I had to do that, she repeated. Your babies? At Mrs. Van Doyen's? But you said they were well now. Yes, said Mary Barkley. She knows how to keep them well. The right air and food. There is so much to know. It isn't simple. If I tried to keep them in the city, she shook her head. Calvin and I always agreed that if we could only bring them safely through the first 5 years, they would be as strong as anybody's children. Their brains are ahead of their bodies, but they aren't weaklings. If they had been, weaklings don't get anything out of life worth staying for. I shouldn't have been able to come here tonight if they hadn't been worthwhile. But you see, I know now, better than I did before, what they are. She broke off with a cry. Yet when Anna would have drawn her arms about her, she evaded her like a mist. Envy me, moaned Mary Barkley, but pity me too. Recovering herself quickly, she leaned forward and spoke rapidly. What becomes of children when fathers and mothers die? Sometimes things turn out all right, I know. It isn't always the same as when parent birds are shot and the nestlings starve, but sometimes it's like that, when there are no relatives to take them and no money has been left for their support. What happens when a little girl is left without a mother to tell her about growing up? And then children are always so themselves. One child is never like another, yet people who don't know try to treat them all alike. My little Martha, she never tells when her heart is broken, or she has a pain and is really sick. She just gets cross and you have to guess. She is apt to be rather naughty anyway. I have to be patient, very. And oh, such strange big thoughts she thinks, and she can suffer too. And then Benny, I suppose it was his sickness that... It was too much. Mrs. Van Doyne saved him. He was dying when I took him there. She saved him, but I didn't take care of Martha right when Benny was sick. So she began to be sick too. What could I do? So I let her have them. Anything less than the best wouldn't do, you see. I sold things, all I could, and went to work to earn money to pay her. Perhaps I worked a little too hard. I thought, I suppose, that so long as I was doing it for them, nothing could beat me. Well, what's done is done. They laugh and have red cheeks, but... She rose and looked down at her friend, then out the window. The nurses are bringing them in from the beach to go to bed. They are very sweet when they are going to bed. Shall we meet them? They stepped from the window to the porch, Mary Barkley going lightly ahead. Her dress of some indefinite color, which mingled with that of the sand, made her almost invisible. There was a long flight of steps leading from the bluff down to the beach. From its summit, the slow footsteps of the nurses and children and their mingled voices were audible before their heads came into sight. One rather fat and sleepy voice counted the steps incorrectly. 1, 2, 3, 17, 100! I got up first! The pioneer appeared abruptly on all fours, something of a wounded veteran by his bandaged head, but cheerful. Terrible warfare he had been through, coming out of it with flags flying, and glory redounding to the surgeon first, but to Mrs. Van Doyne with even honor. He bore the proud title of double mastoid. Death had been close at his heels. Pain unspeakable had held him very tight in her terrible arms for a long time. Silence had threatened too. No more kind voices, no music, but all those ogres had been sent to the right about, far away now from a fat little boy. Already he was forgetting that anything had been wrong. I got up quicker'n anybody, he crowed. Then appeared a white cap, somewhat awry, and strong kerchiefed shoulders. A young face bent over a tiny sleeping creature on an air cushion, carried steadily and lightly. This was the little Marasmus, the latest recruit, and his attendant. Then came just a plain feeding case, whose mother didn't dare take him back for fear that she and he would go and do the same wicked things over again just as soon as his Auntie Van Doyne's back was turned. He was sleeping like a cherub. Nothing whatever the matter with him. He was one of Mrs. Van Doyne's results, said to have been one of the duplicates of the little Marasmus, but now the kind of person that tired-eyed physicians wag their heads over gloatingly and poke in the ribs, not with a stethoscope, and call old Top in a companionable way, as if they respected him for having done something rather fine all on his own responsibility. He had about a year of it, and Mrs. Van Doyne was going to hang on to him as long as she could, for she had her own opinion of mothers. Often and often they had undone her fine work just as she had everything going nicely. They never knew anything whatever of their children's inwardness. Clothes and hair were as far as they could go. She had all that wonderful hidden territory mapped out. She didn't believe in raw milk very much for one thing, and she did believe in a few other things which, well, she got results anyway. Look at old Top. After him came 2 children hand in hand, and these, Anna knew at once, were Mary's 2. She would have known even without the long trembling sigh that breathed past her ear. The little girl looked so much like Mary. She was about 6, Anna judged, and her hair was twisted in a little knob on top of her head for coolness' sake, a fashion of hairdressing for very little girls which, more than any other, perhaps brings a lump to the throat. Is it because of its sweet caricature of maturity, as though both the promise and the menace of the years were revealed in those lines? Or is it that the curve of the back of the neck, shown in this way, is so lovely that it has a spiritual significance, like the odor of the first grass in spring or the color of evening sky through trees? She walked with a rather conceited air, her gait indicating a lofty scorn of the double mastoid's claim to be a pioneer. She made it very evident that she could come up one foot after another, just like all the other grown-ups, and she did it with a swagger to render as obvious as possible her superiority in age, strength, and wisdom over the little boy at her side, who could do no better than one step at a time, and even so had to touch his hand to the tread now and then. They were thin children, but thin like elves, not with the sadness and languor of sickness, and their faces in the twilight had a lambent quality, their eyes a liquid brightness. One felt that if one whim took them, they might easily thrust forth gauzy wings and suddenly sail away with other night creatures. In their conversation there was a pleasing breath of impossibility that showed them to be as yet little acquainted with the restrictions of mortal life. "I am going to be an engineer when I grow up," stated the boy, "but I'm not going to be a man. I'm going to be a mother. My name isn't Benny." "What is your name?" the girl asked, without surprise. "I'm Nellie." "Well, then I won't be Martha. I'll be Rosie, and you're my little sister." She was in a kindly mood, which might not last. Only so long as the current of her dream flowed smoothly would Martha be good. The interruption came quickly. "No, I am your big sister. I am not little at all. Auntie Van Doyne says I'm getting bigger every day." "All right, then. I shan't play with you," quoth Martha, crisply, and stalked ahead, as naughty as her mother had described. And then Anna saw Mary, who had silently left her side, stoop over and apparently whisper softly to the cross little face surmounted by its wisp of a topknot. Martha stopped, finger in mouth, to kick the sand with her toe and look with sidelong friendliness at Benny as he arrived panting. Then they went on, once more in amity, their short arms stretched about each other's waists, and their mother kept beside them, still whispering in their ears and kissing them. Yet they did not turn to her or answer. "I hope Mother'll bring us some paints," Martha was saying, as they passed beyond hearing. "If she does, I'll make her a picture of an engine," Benny joyfully planned. "Mary!" cried Anna. She was surprised to feel that she was trembling, not that she was in any way afraid. She could not have said what had so shaken her. No longer seeing her friend, she laughed and said aloud, "Oh, she must have gone into the house ahead of them." A slower step was now coming up the bluff stairs, and there appeared a figure in professional white, strong and purposeful, but for the moment rather weary and thoughtful. Miss Marston stepped forward. "Good evening, Mrs. Van Doyne. I was coming over to see the Barkley children." The troubled face was crossed by a flash of joyful surprise and relief. "Oh, do you know them? I am so thankful. I wish I'd known before. I've been nearly frantic. Of course, then you know." She took a twist of yellow paper from her belt and handed it to Anna Marston, who did not open it, but trembled very much as she looked at Mrs. Van Doyne, in whose fine, wise eyes the tears glistened and brimmed over unheeded. Tears were something in which Mrs. Van Doyne's code were a matter to be disregarded, like any other physical weakness in a person who never allowed herself to be sick. "I haven't told them, of course. I shall put it off as long as I possibly can. She worked herself to death." She broke off with a burst of that kindly anger to which the very good and just are so easily stirred. Her heart wasn't strong, and the heat finished her. The telegram came this afternoon. "I can't tell you how glad I am to find that you are her friend." So far as I can make out, she had no relatives. She spread out her hands with a sort of desperation. "I do what I can." Anna had heard tales enough to know that "what I can" meant an amazing amount of work without return in money, that it meant great kindliness of which advantage was often taken by weak and selfish people. Not that Mrs. Van Doyne ever told. Nevertheless, it had got about that one of the babies had never paid its board since it was a month old, yet you could have not guessed which one was the delinquent by any difference between its care and that of old Top, or little Marasmus, for example, whose parents came and went in limousines, loaded down with all sorts of expensive, foolish toys, whose wardrobes were all silken fine, and who, when they grew up, would be very high and mighty folk indeed. Old Top, certainly. Marasmus, in all probability, though that was going to be pretty brisk and delicate work for a while. Since you are a friend, went on Mrs. Van Doyne, perhaps you can tell me what to do. I'm not talking about the immediate present. They are here, and they are dear children. Though that Martha's certainly a handful, she half laughed through her tears. But there is so much future. What about the years and years? Anna Marston was still shaking, as though through the heat an icy wind had blown upon her. Once more she was aware of Mary Barclay, vividly aware. But this time it was not with her physical eyes that she seemed to see her. There was no further illusion, if it had been an illusion, of that indistinct figure bending above those little unconscious heads, touching them, kissing them, enveloping them, like a bird hovering over its nest. Instead there was, as it were, an inward vision. She and Mary Barclay were again face to face. But it was not in any way a pitiful entreaty for charity which she read in her friend's eyes. Rather, it was a command. "Dear Mrs. Van Doyne," said Anna, trying to bring her voice under control, "Mary Barclay knows that I am ready to take her place. She knows I want them, both of them, more than anything else in the world." The first sigh of the coming coolness breathed past them from the sea. It was like the long breath of one who, after great restlessness, turns at last to sleep. End of The Substitute, a short story by Georgia Wood Pangborn, from the Harper's Monthly, December 1914. Read by Jennifer Dallman.
The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Kane. The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none. Passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it. Oh, so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone and inquiring how he has passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch with the thick darkness, for the shutters were close-fastened through fear of robbers. And so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily. I had my head in and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed listening, just as I have done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh, no! It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and I pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise, when he had turned in his bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor." Or, "It is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain because death, in approaching him, had stalked his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it, you cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a simple dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot from out the crevice and fell full upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray, as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. And have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the sense? Now I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, Amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet, for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder, louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length, it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub caught all. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused, information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness until at length I found the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh, God! What could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God! No, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now again, hark, louder, 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 louder. Villains, I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. End of The Telltale Heart. Recording by Michelle Kane.
Lost Hearts by M.R. James. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jonathan Arnold. Lost Hearts by M.R. James. It was, as far as I can ascertain, in September of the year 1811, that a post-chaise drew up before the door of Aswarby Hall in the heart of Lincolnshire. The little boy who was the only passenger in the chaise, and who jumped out as soon as it had stopped, looked about him with the keenest curiosity during the short interval that elapsed between the ringing of the bell and the opening of the hall door. He saw a tall, square, red-brick house, built in the reign of Anne. A stone-pillared porch had been added on the purer classical style of 1790. The windows of the house were many, tall and narrow, with small panes and thick white woodwork. A pediment, pierced with a round window, crowned the front. There were wings to right and left, connected by curious glazed galleries, supported by colonnades with the central block. These wings plainly contained the stables and offices of the house. Each was surmounted by an ornamental cupola with a gilded vane. An evening light shone on the building, making the window panes glow like so many fires. Away from the hall in front stretched a flat park studded with oaks and fringed with firs, which stood out against the sky. The clock in the church tower, buried in trees on the edge of the park, only its golden weathercock catching the light, was striking 6, and the sound came gently beating down the wind. It was altogether a pleasant impression, though tinged with the sort of melancholy appropriate to an evening in early autumn, that was conveyed to the mind of the boy who was standing in the porch waiting for the door to open to him. The post-chaise had brought him from Warwickshire, where some 6 months before he'd been left an orphan. Now, owing to the generous offer of his elderly cousin, Mr. Abney, he had come to live at Aswarby. The offer was unexpected, because all who knew anything of Mr. Abney looked upon him as somewhat austere recluse, into whose steady-going household the advent of a small boy would import a new, and it seemed incongruous element. The truth is that very little was known of Mr. Abney's pursuits or temper. The professor of Greek at Cambridge had been heard to say that no one knew more of the religious beliefs of the latter pagans than did the owner of Aswarby. Certainly his library contained all the then available books bearing on the mysteries, the Orphic poems, the worship of Mithras, and the Neoplatonists. In the marble-paved hall stood a fine group of Mithras slaying a bull, which had been imported from the Levant at great expense by the owner. He'd contributed a description of it to the Gentleman's Magazine, and he had written a remarkable series of articles in the Critical Museum on the superstitions of the Romans of the Lower Empire. He was looked upon, in fine, as a man wrapped up in his books, and it was a matter of great surprise among his neighbours that he should ever have heard of his orphan cousin, Stephen Elliot, much more that he should have volunteered to make him an inmate of Aswarby Hall. Whatever man may have been expected by his neighbours, it is certain that Mr. Abney, the tall, the thin, the austere, seemed inclined to give his young cousin a kindly reception. The moment the front door was opened, he darted out of his study, rubbing his hands with delight. "How are you, my boy? How are you? How old are you?" said he. "That is, you are not too much tired, I hope, by your journey to eat your supper?" "No, thank you, sir," said Master Elliot. "I am pretty well." "That's a good lad," said Mr. Abney. "And how old are you, my boy?" It seemed a little odd that he should have asked the question twice in the first 2 minutes of their acquaintance. "I'm 12 years old next birthday, sir," said Stephen. "And when is your birthday, my dear boy?" 11th of September, eh? That's well, that's very well. Nearly a year hence, isn't it? I like to get these things down in my book. Sure it's 12? Certain? Yes, quite sure, sir. Well, take him to Mrs. Bunch's room, Parks, and let him have his tea, supper, whatever it is. Yes, sir, answered the staid Mr. Parks, and conducted Stephen to the lower regions. Mrs. Bunch was the most comfortable and human person whom Stephen had as yet met at Oswarby. She made him completely at home. They were great friends in a quarter of an hour, and great friends they remained. Mrs. Bunch had been born in the neighbourhood some 55 years before the date of Stephen's arrival, and her residence at the Hall was of 20 years' standing. Consequently, if anyone knew the ins and outs of the house and the district, Mrs. Bunch knew them, and she was by no means disinclined to communicate her information. Certainly there were plenty of things about the Hall and the Hall gardens which Stephen, who was of an adventurous and inquiring turn, was anxious to have explained to him. Who built the temple at the end of the Laurel Walk? Who was the old man whose picture hung on the staircase, sitting at a table with a skull under his hand? These and many similar points were cleared up by the resources of Mrs. Bunch's powerful intellect. There were others, however, of which the explanations furnished were less satisfactory. One November evening, Stephen was sitting by the fire in the housekeeper's room, reflecting on his surroundings. "Is Mr. Abney a good man, and will he go to heaven?" he suddenly asked, with the peculiar confidence which children possess in the ability of their elders to settle these questions, the decision of which is believed to be reserved for other tribunals. "Good? Bless the child," said Mrs. Bunch. "Master's as kind a soul as I ever see. Didn't I never tell you of the little boy as he took out in the street, as you may say, this 7 years back, and the little girl 2 years after I first come here?" "No. Do tell me all about them, Mrs. Bunch, now, this minute." "Well," said Mrs. Bunch, "the little girl I don't seem to recollect so much about. I know Master brought her back with him from his walk one day, and gave orders to Mrs. Ellis, as was housekeeper then, as she should be took every care with, and the poor child hadn't no one belonging to her. She telled me so her own self. And here she lived with us a matter of 3 weeks it might be, and then, whether she was something of a gypsy in her blood or what not, but one morning she out of her bed afore any of us had opened an eye, and neither track nor trace of her have I set eyes on since. Master was wonderful about it, and had all the ponds dragged, but it's my belief she had away by them gypsies, for they was singing round the house for as much as an hour the night she went, and Parks, he declared he heard them a-calling in the woods all that afternoon. Dear, a odd child she was, so silent in her ways and all. But I was wonderfully taken up with her, so domesticated she was, surprising." "And what about the little boy?" said Stephen. "Ah, that poor boy," sighed Mrs. Bunch. "He were a foreigner, Jevony he called himself, and he come a-tweaking his hurdy-gurdy round and about the drive one winter day, and Master had him in that minute, and asked all about where he came from, and how old he was, and how he made his way, and where was his relatives, and all as kind a heart as could wish, but it went the same way with him. They're a hunruly lot, them foreign nations, I do suppose, and he was off one fine morning just the same as the girl. Why he went and what he done was our question for as much of a year after, for he never took his hurdy-gurdy, and there it lays on the shelf." The remainder of the evening was spent by Stephen in miscellaneous cross-examination of Mrs. Bunch, and in efforts to extract a tune from the hurdy-gurdy. That night he had a curious dream. At the end of the passage at the top of the house, in which his bedroom was situated, there was an old disused bathroom. It was kept locked, but the upper half of the door was glazed, and, since the muslin curtains which used to hang there had long been gone, you could look in and see the lead-lined bath affixed to the wall on the right hand, with its head towards the window. On the night of which I am speaking, Stephen Elliott found himself, as he thought, looking through the glazed door. The moon was shining through the window, and he was gazing at a figure which lay in the bath. His description of what he saw reminds me of what I once beheld myself in the famous vaults of St. Michan's Church in Dublin, which possesses the horrid property of preserving corpses from decay for centuries. A figure inexpressibly thin and pathetic, of a dusty leaden colour, enveloped in a shroud-like garment, the thin lips crooked into a faint and dreadful smile, the hands pressed tightly over the region of the heart. As he looked upon it, a distant, almost inaudible moan seemed to issue from its lips, and the arms began to stir. The terror of the sight forced Stephen backwards, and he awoke to the fact that he was indeed standing on the cold bordered floor of the passage, in the full light of the moon. With a courage which I do not think can be common among boys of his age, he went to the door of the bathroom to ascertain if the figure in his dreams was really there. It was not, and he went back to bed. Mrs. Bunch was much impressed next morning by his story, and went so far as to replace the muslin curtain over the glazed door of the bathroom. Mr. Abney, moreover, to whom he confided his experiences at breakfast, was greatly interested and made notes of the matter in what he called his book. The spring equinox was approaching, as Mr. Abney frequently reminded his cousin, adding that this had been always considered by the ancients to be a critical time for the young, that Stephen would do well to take care of himself and to shut his bedroom window at night, and that Censorinus had some valuable remark on the subject. 2 incidents that occurred about this time made an impression upon Stephen's mind. The first was after an unusually uneasy and oppressed night that he had passed, though he could not recall any particular dream that he had had. The following evening Mrs. Bunch was occupying herself in mending his nightgown. "Gracious me, Master Stephen," she broke forth rather irritably. "How do you manage to tear your nightdress all to flinders this way? Look here, sir, what trouble you do give poor servants that have to darn and mend after you." There was indeed a most destructive and apparently wanton series of slits, or scorings in the garment, which would undoubtedly require a skilful needle to make good. They were confined to the left side of the chest, long parallel slits about 6 inches in length, some of them not quite piercing the texture of the linen. Stephen could only express his entire ignorance of their origin. He was sure they had not been there the night before. "But," he said, "Mrs. Bunch, they are all just the same as the scratches on the outside of my bedroom door, and I'm sure I never had anything to do with making them." Mrs. Bunch gazed at him open-mouthed, then snatched up a candle, departed hastily from the room, and was heard making her way upstairs. In a few minutes she came down. "Well," she said, "Master Stephen, it's a funny thing to me how them marks and scratchings can a come there. Too high up for any cat or dog to have made 'em, much less a rat. For all the world like a Chinaman's fingernails, as my uncle in the tea trade used to tell us of when we girls was together. I wouldn't say nothing to master, not if I was you, Master Stephen, my dear, and just turn the key of the door when you go to your bed." "I always do, Mrs. Bunch, as soon as I've said my prayers." "Ah, that's a good child. Always say your prayers, and then no one can hurt you." Herewith Mrs. Bunch addressed herself to mending the injured nightgown, with intervals of meditation until bedtime. This was on a Friday night in March 1812. On the following evening the usual duet of Stephen and Mrs. Bunch was augmented by the sudden arrival of Mr. Parkes, the butler, who as a rule kept himself rather to himself in his own pantry. He did not see that Stephen was there. He was, moreover, flustered and less slow of speech than was his wont. "Master may get up his own wine if he likes of an evening," was the first remark. "Either I do it in the daytime or not at all, Mrs. Bunch. I don't know what it may be. Very like it's the rats or the wind got into the cellars. But I'm not so young as I was, and I can't go through with it as I have done. Well, Mr. Parkes, you know it is a surprising place for the rats, is the hall." "I'm not denying that, Mrs. Bunch, and to be sure, many a time I've heard the tale from the men in the shipyards about the rat that could speak. I never laid no confidence in that before, but tonight, if I'd demeaned myself as to lay my ear to the door of the further bin, I could pretty much have heard what they were saying." "Oh, there, Mr. Parkes, I have no patience with your fancies. Rats talking in the wine-cellar, indeed. Well, Mrs. Bunch, I have no wish to argue with you. All I say is, if you choose to go to the far bin and lay your ear to the door, you may prove my words this minute." What nonsense you do talk, Mr. Parks. Not fit for children to listen to. Why, you'll be frightening Master Stephen there out of his wits. What? Master Stephen? Said Parks, awaking to the consciousness of the boy's presence. Master Stephen knows well enough when I'm playing a joke with you, Mrs. Bunch. In fact, Master Stephen knew much too well to suppose that Mr. Parks had in the first instance intended a joke. He was interested, not altogether pleasantly, in the situation, but all his questions were unsuccessful in inducing the butler to give any more detailed account of his experiences in the wine cellar. We have now arrived at March 24th, 1812. It was a day of curious experiences for Stephen, a windy, noisy day which filled the house and the gardens with a restless impression. As Stephen stood by the fence of the grounds and looked out into the park, he felt as if an endless procession of unseen people was sweeping past him on the wind, borne on restlessly and aimlessly, vainly striving to stop themselves, to catch at something that might arrest their flight and bring them once again into contact with the living world of which they had formed a part. After luncheon that day, Mr. Abney said, "Stephen, my boy, do you think you could manage to come to me tonight as late as 11 o'clock in my study? I shall be busy until that time, and I wish to show you something connected with your future life, which it is most important that you should know. You are not to mention this matter to Mrs. Bunch, nor to anyone else in the house, and you had better go to your room at the usual time." Here was a new excitement added to life. Stephen eagerly grasped at the opportunity of sitting up till 11 o'clock. He looked in at the library door on his way upstairs that evening. He saw a brazier, which he had often noticed in the corner of the room, moved out before the fire. An old silver gilt cup stood on the table, filled with red wine, and some written sheets of paper lay near it. Mr. Abney was sprinkling some incense on the brazier from a round silver box as Stephen passed, but did not seem to notice his step. The wind had fallen, and there was a still night and a full moon. About 10 o'clock, Stephen was standing at the open window of his bedroom, looking out over the country. Still as the night was, the mysterious population of the distant moonlit woods was not yet lulled to rest. From time to time, strange cries, as of lost and despairing wanderers, sounded from across the mere. They might be the notes of owls or water birds, yet they did not quite resemble either sound. Were not they coming nearer? Now they sounded from the nearer side of the water, and in a few moments they seemed to be floating about among the shrubberies. Then they ceased, but just as Stephen was thinking of shutting the window and resuming his reading of Robinson Crusoe, he caught sight of two figures standing on the gravelled terrace that ran along the garden side of the hall, the figures of a boy and girl, as it seemed. They stood side by side looking up at the windows. Something in the form of the girl recalled irresistibly his dream of the figure in the bath. The boy inspired him with more acute fear. Whilst the girl stood still, half smiling, with her hands clasped over her heart, the boy, a thin shape, with black hair and ragged clothing, raised his arms in the air, with an appearance of menace and of unappeasable hunger and longing. The moon shone upon his almost transparent hands, and Stephen saw that the nails were fearfully long, and that the light shone through them. As he stood with his arms thus raised, he disclosed a terrifying spectacle. On the left side of his chest there opened a black and gaping rent, and there fell upon Stephen's brain, rather than upon his ear, the impression of one of those hungry and desolate cries that he had heard resounding over the woods of Aswarby all that evening. In another moment this dreadful pair had moved swiftly and noiselessly over the dry gravel, and he saw them no more. Inexpressibly frightened as he was, he determined to take his candle and go down to Mr. Abney's study, for the hour appointed for their meeting was near at hand. The study, or library, opened out on the front hall on one side, and Stephen, urged on by his terrors, did not take long in getting there. To effect an entrance was not so easy. It was not locked, he felt sure, for the key was on the outside of the door as usual. His repeated knocks produced no answer. Mr. Abney was engaged. He was speaking. What? What did he try to cry out? And what was the cry choked in his throat? Had he, too, seen the mysterious children? But now everything was quiet, and the door yielded to Stephen's terrified and frantic pushing. On the table in Mr. Abney's study, certain papers were found which explained the situation to Stephen Elliott, when he was of an age to understand them. The most important sentences were as follows. It was a belief very strongly and generally held by the ancients, of whose wisdom in these matters I have had such experience as induces me to place confidence in their assertions, that by enacting certain processes, which to us moderns have something of a barbaric complexion, a very remarkable enlightenment of the spiritual faculties in man may be attained. That, for example, by absorbing the personalities of a certain number of his fellow creatures, an individual may gain a complete ascendancy over those orders of spiritual beings which control the elemental forces of our universe. It is recorded of Simon Magus that he was able to fly in the air, to become invisible, or to assume any form he pleased, by the agency of the soul of a boy whom, to use the libellous phrase employed by the author of the Clementine Recognitions, he had murdered. I find it set down, moreover, with considerable detail in the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, that similar happy results may be produced by the absorption of the hearts of not less than 3 human beings below the age of 21 years. To the testing of the truth of this receipt, I have devoted the greater part of the last 20 years, selecting as the corpora vilia of my experiment such persons as be conveniently removed without occasioning a sensible gap in society. The first step I effected by the removal of one Phoebe Stanley, a girl of gypsy extraction, on March 24th, 1792. The second by the removal of a wandering Italian lad, named Giovanni Paoli, on the night of March 23rd, 1805. The final victim, to employ a word repugnant in the highest degree to my feelings, must be my cousin, Stephen Elliott. His day must be this March 24th, 1812. The best means of effecting the required absorption is to remove the heart from the living subject, to reduce it to ashes, and to mingle them with about a pint of some red wine, preferably port. The remains of the first 2 subjects, at least, it will be well to conceal. A disused bathroom or wine cellar will be found convenient for such a purpose. Some annoyance may be experienced from the psychic portion of the subjects, which popular language dignifies with the name of ghosts. But the man of philosophic temperament, to whom alone the experiment is appropriate, will be little prone to attach importance to the feeble efforts of these beings to wreak their vengeance on him. I contemplate with the liveliest satisfaction the enlarged and emancipated existence which the experiment, if successful, will confer on me, not only placing me beyond the reach of human justice, so called, but eliminating to great extent the prospect of death itself. Mr. Abney was found in his chair, his head thrown back, his face stamped with an expression of rage, fright, and mortal pain. In his left side was a terrible lacerated wound, exposing the heart. There was no blood on his hands, and the long knife that lay on the table was perfectly clean. A savage wild cat might have inflicted the injuries. The window of the study was open, and it was the opinion of the coroner that Mr. Abney had met his death by the agency of some wild creature. But Stephen Elliott's study of the papers I have quoted led him to a very different conclusion. End of Lost Hearts by M.R. James.
The Wood of the Dead by Algernon Blackwood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Grzinski. The Wood of the Dead by Algernon Blackwood. One summer in my wanderings with a knapsack, I was at luncheon in the room of a wayside inn in the western country, when the door opened and there entered an old rustic who crossed close to my end of the table and sat himself down very quietly in the seat by the bow window. We exchanged glances, or, properly speaking, nods. for at the moment I did not actually raise my eyes to his face. So concerned was I with the important business of satisfying an appetite gained by tramping 12 miles over a difficult country. The fine warm rain of 7 o'clock, which had since risen in a kind of luminous mist about the treetops, now floated far overhead in a deep blue sky, and the day was settling down into a blaze of golden light. It was one of those days peculiar to Somerset and North Devon, when the orchards shine and the meadows seem to add a radiance of their own. So brilliantly soft are the colorings of grass and foliage. The innkeeper's daughter, a little maiden with a simple country loveliness, presently entered with a foaming pewter mug, inquired after my welfare, and went out again. Apparently, she had not noticed the old man sitting in the settle by the bow window, nor had he, for his part, so much as once turned his head in our direction. Under ordinary circumstances, I should probably have given no thought to this other occupant of the room, but the fact that it was supposed to be reserved for my private use, and the singular thing that he sat looking aimlessly out of the window, with no attempt to engage me in conversation, drew my eyes more than once, somewhat curiously, upon him, and I soon caught myself wondering why he sat there so silently, and always with averted head. He was, I saw, a rather bent old man in rustic dress, and the skin of his face was wrinkled like that of an apple. Corduroy trousers were caught up with a string below the knee, and he wore a sort of brown fustian jacket that was very much faded. His thin hand rested upon a stoutish stick. He wore no hat and carried none, and I noticed that his head, covered with silvery hair, was finely shaped and gave the impression of something noble. Though rather piqued by his studied disregard of my presence, I came to the conclusion that he probably had something to do with the little hostel, and had a perfect right to use this room with freedom, and I finished my luncheon without breaking the silence, and then took the settle opposite to smoke a pipe before going on my way. Through the open window came the sense of the blossoming fruit trees. The orchard was drenched in sunshine, and the branches danced lazily in the breeze. The grass below fairly shone with white and yellow daisies. The red roses, climbing in profusion over the casement, mingled their perfume with the sweetly penetrating odor of the sea. It was a place to dawdle in, to lie and dream away a whole afternoon, watching the sleepy butterflies and listening to the chorus of birds which seemed to fill every corner of the sky. Indeed, I was already debating in my mind whether to linger and enjoy it all, instead of taking the strenuous pathway over the hills, when the old rustic in the settle opposite suddenly turned his face towards me for the first time and began to speak. His voice had a quiet, dreamy note in it that was quite in harmony with the day and the scene, but it sounded far away, I thought, almost as though it came to me from outside, where the shadows were weaving their eternal tissue of dreams upon the garden floor. Moreover, there was no trace in it of the rough quality one might naturally have expected. And now that I saw the full face of the speaker for the first time, I noticed with something like a start that the deep, gentle eyes seemed far more in keeping with the timbre of the voice than with the rough and very countrified appearance of the clothes and manner. His voice set pleasant waves of sound in motion towards me, and the actual words, if I remember rightly, were, "You are a stranger in these parts," or, "Is not this part of the country strange to you?" There was no "sir," nor any outward and visible sign of the deference usually paid by real country folk to the town-bred visitor, but in its place a gentleness, almost a sweetness of polite sympathy that was far more of a compliment than either. I answered that I was wandering on foot through a part of the country that was wholly new to me, and that I was surprised not to find a place of such idyllic loveliness marked upon my map. "I have lived here all my life," he said, with a sigh, "and am never tired of coming back to it again." "Then you no longer live in the immediate neighborhood?" "I have moved," he answered briefly, adding after a pause in which his eyes seemed to wander wistfully to the wealth of blossoms beyond the window. But I am almost sorry, for nowhere else have I found the sunshine lie so warmly, the flowers smell so sweetly, or the winds and streams make such tender music. His voice died away into a thin stream of sound that lost itself in the rustle of the rose leaves climbing in at the window, for he turned his head away from me as he spoke and looked out into the garden. But it was impossible to conceal my surprise, and I raised my eyes in frank astonishment on hearing so poetic an utterance from such a figure of a man, though at the same time realizing that it was not in the least inappropriate, and that, in fact, no other sort of expression could have properly been expected from him. "I am sure you are right," I answered at length, when it was clear he had ceased speaking. "Or there is something of enchantment here, of real fairy-like enchantment that makes me think of the visions of childhood days, before one knew anything of... I had been oddly drawn into this vein of speech, some inner force compelling me. But here the spell passed, and I could not catch the thoughts that had a moment before opened a long vista before my inner vision. "To tell you the truth," I concluded lamely, "the place fascinates me, and I am in two minds about going further." Even at this stage, I remember thinking it odd that I should be talking like this with a stranger whom I met in a country inn, for it has always been one of my failings that to strangers my manner is brief to surliness. It was as though we were figures meeting in a dream, speaking without sound, obeying laws not operative in the everyday working world, and about to play with a new scale of space and time, perhaps. But my astonishment passed quickly into an entirely different feeling when I became aware that the old man opposite had turned his head from the window again, and was regarding me with eyes so bright they seemed almost to shine with an inner flame. His gaze was fixed upon my face with an intense ardor, and his whole manner had suddenly become alert and concentrated. There was something about him I now felt for the first time that made little thrills of excitement run up and down my back. I met his look squarely, but with an inward tremor. "Stay, then, a little while longer," he said in a much lower and deeper voice than before. "Stay, and I will teach you something of the purpose of my coming." He stopped abruptly. I was conscious of a decided shiver. "You have a special purpose, then, in coming back?" I asked, hardly knowing what I was saying. "To call away someone," he went on in the same thrilling voice. "Someone who is not quite ready to come, but who is needed elsewhere for a worthier purpose." There was a sadness in his manner that mystified me more than ever. "You mean?" I began with an unaccountable access of trembling. "I have come for someone who must soon move, even as I have moved." He looked me through and through with a dreadfully piercing gaze, but I met his eyes with a full straight stare, trembling though I was, and I was aware that something stirred within me that had never stirred before, though for the life of me I could not have put a name to it or have analyzed its nature. Something lifted and rolled away. For one single second, I understood clearly that the past and the future exist actually, side by side in one immense present, that it was I who moved to and fro among shifting protean appearances. The old man dropped his eyes from my face, and the momentary glimpse of a mightier universe passed utterly away. Reason regained its sway over a dull, limited kingdom. "Come tonight," I heard the old man say. "Come to me tonight into the wood of the dead. Come at midnight." Involuntarily, I clutched the arm of the settle for support, for I then felt that I was speaking with someone who knew more of the real things that are and will be than I could ever know while in the body, working through the ordinary channels of sense, and this curious half-promise of a partial lifting of the veil had its undeniable effect upon me. The breeze from the sea had died away outside, and the blossoms were still. A yellow butterfly floated lazily past the window. The song of the birds hushed. I smelt the sea. I smelt the perfume of heated summer air rising from fields and flowers, the ineffable sense of June and of the long days of the year, and with it, from countless green meadows beyond, came the hum of myriad summer life, children's voices, sweet pipings, and the sound of water falling. I knew myself to be on the threshold of a new order of experience, of an ecstasy. Something drew me forth with a sense of inexpressible yearning towards the being of this strange old man in the window seat, and for a moment I knew what it was to taste a mighty and wonderful sensation, and to touch the highest pinnacle of joy I have ever known. It lasted for less than a second and was gone, but in that brief instant of time, the same terrible lucidity came to me that had already shown me how the past and future exist in the present. And I realized and understood that pleasure and pain are one and the same force, for the joy I had just experienced included also all the pain I ever had felt or ever could feel. The sunshine grew to dazzling radiance, faded, passed away. The shadows paused in their dance upon the grass, deepened a moment, and then melted into air. The flowers of the fruit trees laughed with their little silvery laughter as the wind sighed over their radiant eyes the old, old tale of its personal love. Once or twice a voice called my name. A wonderful sensation of lightness and power began to steal over me. Suddenly the door opened, and the innkeeper's daughter came in. By all ordinary standards, hers was a charming country loveliness, born of the stars and wildflowers, of moonlight shining through autumn mists upon the river and the fields. Yet by contrast with the higher order of beauty I had just momentarily been in touch with, she seemed almost ugly. How dull her eyes, how thin her voice, how vapid her smile, and insipid her whole presentment. For a moment she stood between me and the occupant of the window seat, while I counted out the small change for my meal and for her services. But when, an instant later, she moved aside, I saw that the settle was empty, and that there was no longer anyone in the room but our two selves. This discovery was no shock to me. Indeed, I had almost expected it, and the man had gone just as a figure goes out of a dream, causing no surprise, and leaving me as part and parcel of the same dream without breaking of continuity. But as soon as I had paid my bill and thus resumed in a very practical fashion the thread of my normal consciousness, I turned to the girl and asked her if she knew the old man who had been sitting in the window seat, and what he had meant by the wood of the dead. The maiden started visibly, glancing quickly round the empty room, but answering simply that she had seen no one. I described him in great detail, and then, as the description grew clearer, she turned a little pale under her pretty sunburn, and said very gravely that it must have been the ghost. "Ghost? What ghost?" "Oh, the village ghost," she said quietly, coming closer to my chair with a little nervous movement of genuine alarm, and adding in a lower voice, "He comes before a death, they say." It was not difficult to induce the girl to talk, and the story she told me, shorn of the superstition that had obviously gathered with the years round the memory of a strangely picturesque figure, was an interesting and peculiar one. The inn, she said, was originally a farmhouse, occupied by a yeoman farmer, evidently of a superior, if rather eccentric character, who had been very poor until he reached old age, when his son died suddenly in the colonies and left him an unexpected amount of money, almost a fortune. The old man thereupon altered no whit his simple manner of living, but devoted his income entirely to the improvement of the village and to the assistance of its inhabitants. He did this quite regardless of his personal likes and dislikes, as if one and all were absolutely alike to him, objects of a genuine and impersonal benevolence. People had always been a little afraid of the man, not understanding his eccentricities, but the simple force of this love for humanity changed all that in a very short space of time, and before he died, he came to be known as the father of the village, and was held in great love and veneration by all. A short time before his end, however, he began to act queerly. He spent his money just as usefully and wisely, but the shock of sudden wealth after a life of poverty, people said, had unsettled his mind. He claimed to see things that others did not see, to hear voices, and to have visions. Evidently, he was not of the harmless, foolish visionary order, but a man of character and of great personal force, for the people became divided in their opinions, and the vicar, good man, regarded and treated him as a special case. For many, his name and atmosphere became charged almost with a spiritual influence that was not of the best. People quoted texts about him, kept, when possible, out of his way, and avoided his house after dark. None understood him, but though the majority loved him, an element of dread and mystery became associated with his name, chiefly owing to the ignorant gossip of the few. A grove of pine trees behind the farm, the girl pointed them out to me on the slope of the hill, he said was the wood of the dead, because just before anyone died in the village, he saw them walk into that wood singing. None who went in ever came out again. He often mentioned the names to his wife, who usually published them to all the inhabitants within an hour of her husband's confidence. And it was found that the people he had seen enter the wood died. On warm summer nights, he would sometimes take an old stick and wander out hatless under the pines, for he loved this wood, and used to say he met all his old friends there, and would one day walk in there never to return. His wife tried to break him gently off this habit, but he always had his own way, and once, when she followed and found him standing under a great pine in the thickest portion of the grove, talking earnestly to someone she could not see, he turned and rebuked her very gently, but in such a way that she never repeated the experiment, saying, "You should never interrupt me, Mary, when I am talking with the others, for they teach me, remember, wonderful things, and I must learn all I can before I go to join them." This story went like wildfire through the village, increasing with every repetition until at length everyone was able to give an accurate description of the great veiled figures the woman declared she had seen moving among the trees where her husband stood. The innocent pine grove now became positively haunted, and the title of Wood of the Dead clung naturally, as if it had been applied to it in the ordinary course of events by the compilers of the Ordnance Survey. On the evening of his 90th birthday, the old man went up to his wife and kissed her. His manner was loving and very gentle, and there was something about him besides, she declared afterwards, that made her slightly in awe of him, and feel that he was almost more of a spirit than a man. He kissed her tenderly on both cheeks, but his eyes seemed to look right through her as he spoke. "Dearest wife," he said, "I am saying goodbye to you, for I am now going into the wood of the dead, and I shall not return. Do not follow me, or send to search, but be ready soon to come upon the same journey yourself." The good woman burst into tears and tried to hold him, but he easily slipped from her hands, and she was afraid to follow him. Slowly she saw him cross the field in the sunshine, and then entered the cool shadows of the grove, where he disappeared from her sight. That same night, much later, she woke to find him lying peacefully by her side in bed, with one arm stretched out towards her, dead. Her story was half believed, half doubted at the time, But in a very few years afterwards, it evidently came to be accepted by all the countryside. A funeral service was held to which the people flocked in great numbers, and everyone approved of the sentiment which led the widow to add the words, "the father of the village," after the usual texts which appeared upon the stone over his grave. This, then, was the story I pieced together of the village ghost, as the little innkeeper's daughter told it to me that afternoon in the parlor of the inn. "But you're not the first to say you've seen him," the girl concluded, "and your description is just what we've always heard. And that window, they say, was just where he used to sit and think when he was alive. And sometimes, they say, to cry for hours together." "And would you feel afraid if you had seen him?" I asked, for the girl seemed strangely moved and interested in the whole story. "I think so," she answered timidly. "Surely, if he spoke to me. He did speak to you, didn't he, sir?" she asked after a slight pause. "He said he had come for someone." "Come for someone," she repeated. "Did he say?" she went on falteringly. "No, he did not say for whom," I said quickly, noticing the sudden shadow on her face and the tremulous voice. "Are you really sure, sir?" "Oh, quite sure," I answered cheerfully. "I did not even ask him." The girl looked at me steadily for nearly a whole minute, as though there were many things she wished to tell me or to ask. But she said nothing, and presently picked up her tray from the table and walked slowly out of the room. Instead of keeping to my original purpose and pushing on to the next village over the hills, I ordered a room to be prepared for me at the inn, and that afternoon I spent wandering about the fields and lying under the fruit trees, watching the white clouds sailing out over the sea. The Wood of the Dead I surveyed from a distance, but in the village I visited the stone erected to the memory of the father of the village, who was thus evidently no mythical personage, and saw also the monuments of his fine, unselfish spirit, the schoolhouse he built, the library, the home for the aged poor, and the tiny hospital. That night, as the clock in the church tower was striking 11:30, I stealthily left the inn and crept through the dark orchard and over the hayfield in the direction of the hill, whose southern slope was clothed with the Wood of the Dead. A genuine interest impelled me to the adventure, but I also was obliged to confess to a certain sinking in my heart as I stumbled along over the field in the darkness, for I was approaching what might prove to be the birthplace of a real country myth, and a spot already lifted by the imaginative thoughts of a considerable number of people into the region of the haunted and ill-omened. The inn lay below me, and all round it the village clustered in a soft black shadow, unrelieved by a single light. The night was moonless, yet distinctly luminous, for the stars crowded the sky. The silence of deep slumber was everywhere, so still indeed that every time my foot kicked against a stone I thought the sound must be heard below in the village and waken the sleepers. I climbed the hill slowly, thinking chiefly of the strange story of the noble old man who had seized the opportunity to do good to his fellows the moment it came his way, and wondering why the causes that operate ceaselessly behind human life did not always select such admirable instruments. Once or twice a night bird circled swiftly over my head, but the bats had long since gone to rest, and there was no other sign of life stirring. Then suddenly, with a singular thrill of emotion, I saw the first trees of the Wood of the Dead rise in front of me in a high black wall. Their crests stood up like giant spears against the starry sky, and though there was no perceptible movement of the air on my cheek, I heard a faint rushing sound among the branches as the night breeze passed to and fro over their countless little needles. A remote, hushed murmur rose overhead and died away again almost immediately. For in these trees the wind seems to be never absolutely at rest, and on the calmest day there is always a sort of whispering music among the branches. For a moment I hesitated on the edge of this dark wood, and listened intently. Delicate perfumes of earth and bark stole out to meet me. Impenetrable darkness faced me. Only the consciousness that I was obeying an order strangely given, and including a mighty privilege, enabled me to find the courage to go forward and step in boldly under the trees. Instantly the shadows closed in upon me, and something came forward to meet me from the center of the darkness. It would be easy enough to meet my imagination halfway with fact, and say that a cold hand grasped my own and led me by invisible paths into the unknown depths of the grove. But at any rate, without stumbling, and always with the positive knowledge that I was going straight towards the desired object, I pressed on confidently and securely into the wood. So dark was it that at first not a single starbeam pierced the roof of branches overhead, and as we moved forward side by side, the trees shifted silently past us in long lines, row upon row, squadron upon squadron, like the units of a vast, soundless army. And at length we came to a comparatively open space where the trees halted upon us for a while, and looking up I saw the white river of the sky beginning to yield to the influence of a new light that now seemed spreading swiftly across the heavens. "It is the dawn coming," said the voice at my side that I certainly recognized, but which seemed almost like a whispering from the trees. "And we are now in the heart of the Wood of the Dead." We seated ourselves on a moss-covered boulder and waited the coming of the sun. With marvelous swiftness, it seemed to me, the light in the east passed into the radiance of early morning, and when the wind awoke and began to whisper in the treetops, the first rays of the risen sun fell between the trunks and rested in a circle of gold at our feet. "Now come with me," whispered my companion in the same deep voice, "for time has no existence here, and that which I would show you is already there." We trod gently and silently over the soft pine needles. Already the sun was high over our heads, and the shadows of the trees coiled closely about their feet. The wood became denser again, but occasionally we passed through little open bits where we could smell the hot sunshine and the dry, baked pine needles. Then presently we came to the edge of the grove, and I saw a hayfield lying in the blaze of day, and 2 horses basking lazily with switching tails in the shafts of a laden hay wagon. So complete and vivid was the sense of reality that I remember the grateful realization of the cool shade where we sat and looked out upon the hot world beyond. The last pitchfork had tossed up its fragrant burden, and the great horses were already straining in the shafts after their driver as he walked slowly in front with one hand upon their bridles. He was a stalwart fellow with sunburned neck and hands. Then, for the first time, I noticed, perched aloft upon the trembling throne of hay, the figure of a slim young girl. I could not see her face, but her brown hair escaped in disorder from a white sunbonnet, and her still browner hands held a well-worn hay-rake. She was laughing and talking with the driver, and he, from time to time, cast up at her ardent glances of admiration, glances that won instant smiles and soft blushes in response. The cart presently turned into the roadway that skirted the edge of the wood where we were sitting. I watched the scene with intense interest, and became so much absorbed in it that I quite forgot the manifold strange steps by which I was permitted to become a spectator. "Come down and walk with me," cried the young fellow, stopping a moment in front of the horses and opening wide his arms. "Jump, and I'll catch you." Oh, she laughed, and her voice sounded to me as the happiest, merriest laughter I had ever heard from a girl's throat. Oh, and that's all very well, but remember, I'm queen of the hay, and I must ride. Then I must come and ride beside you, he cried, and began at once to climb up by way of the driver's seat. But with a peal of silvery laughter, she slipped down easily over the back of the hay to escape him, and ran a little way along the road. I could see her quite clearly, and noticed the charming natural grace of her movements, and the loving expression in her eyes as she looked over her shoulder to make sure he was following. Evidently, she did not wish to escape for long, certainly not forever. In 2 strides, the big brown swain was after her, leaving the horses to do as they pleased. Another second, and his arms would have caught the slender waist and pressed the little body to his heart. But just at that instant, the old man beside me uttered a peculiar cry. It was low and thrilling, and it went through me like a sharp sword. He had called her by her own name, and she had heard. For a second she halted, glancing back with frightened eyes. Then, with a brief cry of despair, the girl swerved aside and dived in swiftly among the shadows of the trees. But the young man saw the sudden movement and cried out to her passionately. "Not that way, my love, not that way. It's the wood of the dead." She threw a laughing glance over her shoulder at him, and the wind caught her hair and drew it out in a brown cloud under the sun. But the next minute she was close beside me, lying on the breast of my companion, and I was certain I heard the words repeatedly uttered with many sighs. "Father, you called, and I have come, and I come willingly, for I am very, very tired." At any rate, so the words sounded to me, and mingled with them I seemed to catch the answer in that deep, thrilling whisper I already knew. "And you shall sleep, my child. Sleep for a long, long time, until it is time for you to begin the journey again." In that brief second of time I had recognized the face and voice of the innkeeper's daughter. But the next minute a dreadful wail broke from the lips of the young man, and the sky grew suddenly as dark as night. The wind rose and began to toss the branches about us, and the whole scene was swallowed up in a wave of utter blackness. Again the chill fingers seemed to seize my hand, and I was guided by the way I had come to the edge of the wood, and crossing the hayfield still slumbering in the starlight, I crept back to the inn and went to bed. A year later, I happened to be in the same part of the country, and the memory of the strange summer vision returned to me with the added softness of distance. I went to the old village and had tea under the same orchard trees at the same inn. But the little maid of the inn did not show her face, and I took occasion to inquire of her father as to her welfare and her whereabouts. "Married, no doubt," I laughed, but with a strange feeling that clutched at my heart. "No, sir," replied the innkeeper sadly. "Not married, though she was just going to be, but dead. She got a sunstroke in the hayfields just a few days after you were here, if I remember rightly, and she was gone from us in less than a week." End of The Wood of the Dead by Algernon Blackwood.
The Phantom Town by WFG. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Phantom Town by WFG, from the Dublin Penny Journal, Volume 4, 1835. Sir, the following story is founded on a legend well known on the Kerry shore of the Shannon. I imagine it originated in something like the Fata Morgana of the Bay of Naples, or some such appearances as those noticed in a former number of your journal, as having been observed along the Causeway coast. WFG. On a bright summer's morning, as I stood on one of the tremendous cliffs which overhang the broad Shannon at its mouth, where the unceasing war of the Atlantic's gigantic waves had fretted and foamed for ages, among the caves and hollows of this iron-bound coast, gradually a shade was thrown on the bosom of the placid, glass-like river. As I gazed on the smooth waters, the shadows increased,
and imperceptibly began to take palpable forms. My wonder increased on perceiving, slowly developed, the shadowy forms of towers, steeples, and turreted castles which spread themselves on every side. There was to be seen, clearly defined, a noble town. On a sudden I heard a noise, as of rushing waters, accompanied with what I took to be wailings and lamentations. Looking towards the sea, I saw the white-crested waves rushing with impetuosity towards the shadowy town. On they came, and in a moment all had vanished, except one solitary castle at its farthest extremity. From this, as I gazed with increased astonishment, issued the form of a warrior, armed, and mounted on a jet-black horse. On his crupper was seated a female form, who clung closely to the warrior with one hand. The other she alternately waved towards where the town was and the shore where I stood. They buffeted with the waves for a few moments, then sunk midst the boiling surges. As I turned with melancholy feelings from viewing these strange appearances, I heard a voice calling me in a commanding tone to remain. I stood transfixed. A venerable old man, in the garb of a monk, was advancing from the face of the cliffs towards me. "Stay, O man," said he, "and hear from me the melancholy story of the strange sights to which you have been an unbidden spectator. I alone, destined for my punishment to remain on earth till time shall be no more, can explain these wonders. Centuries have passed," he continued, "since these now deserted shores were enlivened by the neighborhood of a large and populous town, such as you have just now seen reflected on the waters. Buried many fathoms beneath these waves lie the palaces and castles of princes and barons of this land. How so great a calamity happened you shall hear. The castle of King Ulic was illuminated for a general banquet and rejoicing. His queen had given birth to a daughter, heiress to his throne and possessions. The numerous retainers of the king occupied each side of the immense board, which reached from end to end of the great hall. At the head, on a throne elevated above the rest, sat the king himself. The night was nearly spent, and many of the revelers retired, when a stranger was observed standing just within the threshold, intently gazing on the king. All eyes were quickly turned on the intruder, who, seeing he was observed, walked deliberately up the hall. When he approached the king, he drew from under his ample robe a scroll of parchment, placed it before him, and retired, as if to observe its effect. The king took up the parchment and read as follows: "O king, when thy daughter a stranger shall wed, whose hand with the blood of her father is red, where thy castles now stand the broad Scheinman shall cover, and thy courtyard the grave of the maid and her lover." "Seize that evil-boding stranger," cried the king, greatly excited by what he had read. 100 armed men started to their feet, but the stranger was nowhere to be found. How he had entered or how departed, no man could tell. All present, deeply moved at the incident, deserted the banquet and retired to rest. Adjoining Ulic's territories were those of MacMurchard, the powerful chieftain of Leinster. These princes had united in amity in order to repel the English invader. MacMurchard had a son, then 6 years old, to whom Ulic determined to betroth his infant daughter. He sent a trusty messenger to negotiate this treaty, and the marriage contract was ratified with the full consent of all parties. MacMurchard, in order that his son should possess that learning of the schools which his ancestors despised, sent him to his brother's convent in France, where he was to remain until able to bear arms. 16 years had passed. The young MacMurchard had long since returned, and became a successful wooer in person to the beautiful Eva. The day was fixed for the ceremony, and all was preparation for the festivity. Some days previous to the marriage, MacMurchard's brother, the monk, unexpectedly arrived from France. He came, he said, to look once more on his native land before he died. At length the bridal morn arrived, most inauspiciously gloomy and tempestuous. The young MacMurchard led his timid bride to the altar. They pledged their mutual vows, and the ceremony was finished. At this moment a voice was heard, saying, "Ulic, Ulic, thy destiny is nearly accomplished." All eyes immediately turned towards that part of the chapel from which the voice came, and Ulic's followers instantly recognized the figure of the stranger monk who had so mysteriously entered with the prophetic scroll. "Ulic," said he as he advanced, "look on me and recognize the enemy of thy youth, Allan MacMurchard. Hast thou forgotten the day when you disgraced my manhood with a vile blow? Thinkest thou that because my father, treating me as a hot-brained boy, interfered to prevent my staining my hands with thy coward blood, that I have forgotten that degrading stain? You were my senior in years and strength. You struck me. I swore an oath that I would not die until I had amply revenged the dishonor. That hour is now arrived. Far towards the black north I traveled, to a mighty sorceress, to procure that prophetic scroll. I it was who placed it on thy board. By my means thy daughter is wedded to a stranger, and thy ruin certain. Know, proud king, that my brother's son, the young MacMurchard, lived but a few hours after his arrival at the convent. I, knowing of the marriage contract with your daughter, reared up an orphan peasant as the heir of MacMurchard, and a base-born Frenchman's son as the bridegroom you have chosen. Then perish, minion, said Ulick, drawing his sword, and with thy death leave that accursed spell still unaccomplished. He made a lunge toward the bridegroom, but the monk, seeing his intention, threw himself between them, received the wound in his side, and fell. The young MacMurchard, as we shall still call him, then obliged to defend himself from the furious king, being hard pressed, made a desperate pass at Ulick, who fell mortally wounded. Fly, cried the monk with a faint voice. Hear you not the roar of the raging waters? Take up your fainting bride and fly while there is yet hope. All fled from the chapel on hearing this awful announcement of the dying monk. The young MacMurchard, bearing the inanimate form of the lady, hastened toward the stables and led forth his trusty black war-horse. The lady, now restored to animation, he placed behind him, and prepared to ride from the threatened danger, but it was too late. The lamentations and drowning cries of the inhabitants, borne on the winds, announced that some dreadful occurrence had taken place. As he advanced to the gate, the rush of the mighty ocean was heard. In a moment the gates were closed by the violence of the waves. MacMurchard, still hoping to escape, clung to his horse, supporting his bride, but a gigantic billow was seen rolling along with resistless impetuosity. They rode on its summit for a moment, and were overwhelmed to rise no more. All that inhabited that peninsula were totally swallowed up by the rapacious element. Once in 100 years the phantom town is seen in its wonted situation, and the events of that tremendous day are acted over again, and I, the guilty monk, MacMurchard, an unwilling spectator of my evil work. He ceased. I looked once more at the waters, now ruffled by the western breeze, and turned again to address the spectre monk. He was gone. I departed, and never since visited the neighborhood of the phantom town. End of The Phantom Town, recorded by Colleen McMahon.